Carl, sometimes I like to play a game with people where I kind of highlight how it's very difficult to ascertain what the biblical view is about an issue. The Bible is a very complex book, and it's easy to just kind of support different views on a particular issue. So let's try this. Give me an issue. I'll try to use the Bible to support both sides of the issue. You know, one side saying, yes, it's good, one side saying it's bad. What issue do you want me to do? Okay, good. Whether it's acceptable or not to kill your boss. Hi, and welcome to this video lecture. Does God command the slaughter of children in the Bible? Carl, we gotta find some lighter subjects, man. This is heavy stuff. Our main goal in this video is to look at passages from the Hebrew Scriptures that suggest that the slaughter of infants and children was commanded by God. To do this well, we're going to have to first look at some preliminary issues about, again, what it means to read the Bible. Then we're going to take a look at a few passages in which it seems like God does command the destruction of children and infants. Finally, we're going to explore why this issue is problematic for Jews and Christians, and also critically examine how people have responded to this issue. All right, let's get started. It's important to begin this conversation with a note about this notion that we can discover the biblical view on an issue. No, Carl, you can't kill your boss, okay? Let it go. I'm gonna start looking into whether or not you can kill your cameraman. Doesn't matter that they didn't have cameras back there, Carl. I'll use analogous reasoning. It'll work. Anytime we try to establish the biblical view on an issue, we're going to discover that the Bible often has more than one thing to say about an issue. Let's recall that the Bible is not a single book written by a single author. Rather, the Bible is a host of manuscripts, written, translated, edited by many different scholars over a large period of time. The Bible represents a number of different cultural backgrounds, ranging from somewhere around perhaps 1000 BCE to almost 100 CE. Because it's written and edited and translated in so many different cultural settings and so many different historical backgrounds, you're going to find a lot of diversity of views in the Bible. One place where this is evident is the notion of government. Is it good for Israel to have a king, or is it bad for Israel to have a king? In some places, like the end of Judges, the Bible suggests that Israel needs a king. In other areas, like in 1 Samuel, the Bible suggests that Israel desiring a king is somehow a failing and a rejection of God. We can do this with a number of different questions and issues, but the point to make here is that the Bible does not always clearly present us with an uncontested view. There's diversity within the Bible, and we should learn to appreciate that. So for the question of war and violence, especially the slaughter of children, it's probably helpful to note that there's not a single view in the Bible. There's a number of different views that are coming out of different historical contexts. And this raises another point that it's important for us to consider. No part of the Bible was written in a vacuum. The Bible was written and edited within cultural contexts, and these cultural contexts influence what's in the Bible. There are things in the Hebrew Scriptures that might shock our cultural sensibilities today. For example, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the notion of enslaving conquered peoples, the notion that women or children could be viewed as property, and so on and so forth. But it's important to read these texts within their cultural milieu. Now, that's not to suggest that we should say, oh, it's fine that people thought that, or that was good at the time, or anything to that nature. It just helps us to understand this text is representing a different time and has to be read as such. With these caveats in place, let's consider a brief question. Does God accept or demand child sacrifice in the Bible? Well, if by child sacrifice we mean a ritualistic killing of one's own child or a child to appease a god, then the answer seems to be clearly no. God does not accept this. It is true that God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but also bear in mind that God stops Abraham from going through with it. And there are a number of scholars who have read this narrative as a polemic against child sacrifice, demonstrating that God doesn't like it. Furthermore, there are passages in the Bible where God seems to express disdain for the practice of child sacrifice. One final point can be made that animal sacrifice seems to replace the practice of child sacrifice in Israelite culture. But while God does not command child sacrifice in this sense, God does command the slaughter of children and the slaughter of infants in what seems to be almost a sacrificial manner. To understand this point, we have to explore the notion of cherem. Cherem is a Hebrew word, sometimes understood as holy war, which is really misleading. A better understanding of cherem is something that is devoted to destruction or something that is banned from a particular setting. Think of it like this, something that is cut off completely in order to avoid contamination or in order to express thanks or acknowledgement that God has provided for someone. On the one hand, we can think of cherem as a surgery to remove cancer. It's important that the cancer be completely removed so that it doesn't continue to infect the body. On the other hand, we can think of cherem as offering up something to God as a way of thanking God or acknowledging God's provision for you. But it's important to note that cherem seems to have a sacrificial tone to it. That is, things or people are being offered up to God. The reason cherem is important for this particular conversation is because God, at times, demands that the Israelites engage in cherem not necessarily toward objects, but toward people. In other words, God demands that Israel devote a group of people to destruction. That is, completely annihilate them. There are a number of passages that deal with the notion of war in this sense in the Hebrew Bible. One example is Numbers 31. However, because that passage doesn't explicitly mention the notion of cherem, we're going to bypass it now and look instead to Deuteronomy chapter 20, where some rules for warfare are laid out. Generally speaking, the rules for warfare in Israel require that the town that Israel is besieging be offered peace first. If Israel's enemies accept these terms, they are forced into servitude under Israel. If they don't accept these terms, Israel is permitted to siege the city and destroy all the men. However, the women and the children are allowed to be taken by Israel as plunder. That is, they are forced into servitude. However, these rules of war only apply to kingdoms that are far away. The kingdoms that are close to Israel in the Promised Land, and this is in the context of when they're entering into the Promised Land, these kingdoms that are close, and there are 7 of them listed, they are not to be offered peace, they are to be devoted to destruction. Cherem. The rationale in Deuteronomy chapter 20 is that the entire people should be destroyed so that they don't lead Israel into sin. The text states, "You shall annihilate them, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorred things they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God." Interestingly enough, the abhorrent things might actually include child sacrifice. So in this sense, the annihilation of one group, including the children, seems to be a way of preventing child sacrifice of Israel's own children, I guess. While Deuteronomy chapter 20 does mention the notion of cherem and includes the notion of the annihilation of a people, it's not as clearly laid out as it is in other places. So let's take a look at a few other passages. In the book of Joshua, the notion of cherem appears frequently. One place it appears is with reference to the Battle of Jericho. Many people are familiar with the Battle of Jericho. They know the story about Israel walking around for 7 days and then 7 times on the 7th day and then blowing a bunch of horns and then the walls of Jericho fall down. It's been put into songs and things like that. Carl, do they make that in the children's stories too? Because I swear, if they keep making these terrible stories into children's stories, I'm gonna pull my hair out. One lesser known part about the Battle of Jericho is the command that Joshua gives to the people about the battle. And here we should note that Joshua is presumably and implicitly speaking on behalf of God. Joshua states, "The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction." Only Rahab and her family are spared because she helped some Israelite spies earlier in the narrative. But the rest of the city is to be destroyed. Everything destroyed. And the people obey Joshua's command. The text states, "Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys." Now here we have a clearer depiction of the notion of cherem. Everything in the city is devoted to destruction. Men, women, children, animals, everything is destroyed. It's offered up to God for the sake of Israel's own purity, and as a way of acknowledging God's absolute lordship. However, in the book of Joshua, God's complicity in this command is only implicit. That is, it doesn't clearly state that God commands this. Joshua gives the command to the people. It's implied that God is commanding it and that Joshua is speaking on God's behalf, but it's not explicit. There is, however, a passage where it is made explicit. To get to this passage, we have to go into the period of Israel's early monarchy, when Saul was king. This takes us into the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 15. Speaking through the prophet Samuel, God commands Saul to destroy the Amalekites. And again, we have here this notion of cherem, the destruction of the Amalekites, the total annihilation of them. And this command is given because the Amalekites gave Israel a hard time when they were coming up out of Egypt. God is now exacting revenge upon the Amalekites. Here's how the text words God's command to Saul. "Now go and attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So here we have an explicit command from God through the prophet Samuel to the king of Israel to utterly annihilate an entire nation. And this explicitly includes children and infants, men and women, animals. But the story becomes a little bit more interesting still. Saul obeys to a degree. He goes, he utterly annihilates everything. All the men, all the women, all the children, all the infants, all the animals, except he doesn't kill the king of Amalek. He brings him back. He also doesn't kill the best animals. He brings those animals back to make a separate sacrifice to God. After Saul does this, God comes to Samuel, and God says, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not carried out my commands." So Saul slaughters almost every single person in Amalek. But God regrets making Saul king because he didn't slaughter everyone and everything. In other words, Saul fails God because Saul doesn't slaughter enough people. And again, remember, we are including children and infants in this narrative. So to the question, does God command the slaughter of children and infants in the Bible? Yes. 1 Samuel 15 provides a very clear, explicit command from God through the prophet Samuel that Saul, the king of Israel, is to completely annihilate the people of Amalek. This command explicitly includes men, women, children, infants, and animals. And because this notion of cherem is there is at least arguably a tone of sacrifice devoted to destruction, offered up to God. And because it's children that are being implicated here, there is a sacrificial notion of killing children on behalf of God for God's sake. But again, this doesn't really fit that ritualistic notion of child sacrifice that we discussed earlier. But still, it's a religiously motivated slaughtering of children, so still not good. Now that we have established that God does in fact command the slaughtering of children and infants in the Bible, let's start off by discussing why this is problematic for Christians and Jews. Because for both of these groups, the Hebrew Bible is an inspired authoritative text. Two problems come to mind. First, the features of cherem violate our moral sensibilities. Second, the notion of cherem seems to challenge the notion that God is perfectly good and loving. Why does it challenge the notion? Why does it confront our moral sensibilities? Well, on the one hand, cherem seems to resemble the modern notion of genocide, the complete destruction, the complete annihilation of a whole people. On the other hand, cherem demands the slaughter of what we, and I think almost any reasonable person today, would call innocent people. In particular, the children and the infants. For both of these reasons, God's command to slaughter children and infants through the notion of cherem is problematic, theologically and morally. So, how do Jews and Christians deal with this issue? I would like to spend the rest of this video critically examining a few responses to the notion of cherem in the Hebrew Bible. I'm not going to say that this is an exhaustive list of all responses that have been offered, but it's some of the most common ones that I've encountered. And for each response, I'm going to suggest a reason why the response might not be perfectly satisfactory. First, the cultural milieu response. This response notes that the notion of cherem was a cultural practice, and that Israel was simply reflecting the culture in which they were living at the time. It is true that cherem was a cultural practice. For example, consider the Mesha stele. This is a stone tablet inscribed by a Moabite king around about the 9th century BCE. The Moabite king tells about how Moab was conquered by Israel because the Moabite god was angry with Moab. It's interesting to consider that other nations at the time were also thinking about their gods being angry with them and using other nations to punish them. But then the Moabite god returns to Moab and allows the king to strike back at Israel. And the Moabite king goes and lays waste to an Israelite town. And the word here used is cherem. He devotes it to destruction. He destroys all of it as an offering. And here the language of sacrifice is pretty clear. It's an offering to their god. So it was a cultural practice at the time. But this raises the question. There are lots of cultural practices, like explicit child sacrifice, that God doesn't seem to be okay with. And if God is perfectly good and perfectly loving, wouldn't we expect God to be countercultural in these moments, not embracing culture? In other words, if God did command this, God is not exonerated by references to cultural sensibilities. 2. The mythological response. Archaeological evidence doesn't really support the kinds of claims the Bible makes about the conquest of Canaan. For example, the Battle of Jericho probably didn't happen exactly the way it's described in the Bible. This isn't to say that there was no conquest, but that the conquest probably wasn't as definitive and destructive as sometimes it's presented in the Bible. The problem with this view is that cherem is still viewed as a divinely approved action in the Bible. The ideology is still present, even if the historical factuality isn't. It still raises the problem. In this book that is supposed to be theologically and morally authoritative for Jews and Christians, this ideology is embraced at this point in time. That seems to be an issue. 3. The greater good response. The greater good response is best understood as an analogy. Again, going back to that notion of cancer. If you have cancer in your body, you do what you can to cut it out. You try to cut it completely out. Otherwise, it may continue to affect the body. This is a well-accepted medical principle. The problem is whether or not the analogy works when we start bringing people into the equation. Cutting out part of our own body is fine because we don't die. No one dies in that case. But destroying an entire nation in a genocidal act? Well, that's not necessarily analogous. And even if it were for some greater good, we have to ask the question, are we really comfortable with the greater good argument? Those kinds of arguments are dangerous, especially when they're used to justify acts of genocide. Do we really want to say that it's acceptable for God to take the greater good path when doing that requires the destruction of children, of infants, of an entire people in genocide? It just seems like that's a problematic path to take. 4. The collective guilt response. This response goes back to a passage in Exodus chapter 34, where God reveals and explains the divine name to Moses. And as part of that explanation, God says of God's self, God visits the iniquity of the parents upon the children, and the children's children, to the 3rd and 4th generation. This notion of collective guilt, that children and grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, can be held accountable and punished for the sins of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, does seem to be present in that passage. But it still would violate our moral sensibilities today. We don't accept today that you can kill a child because his parent was a serial killer. Now, collective guilt can be a thing if we acknowledge that certain people continue to benefit from the crimes of the past, and those benefits need to be redressed. But that's not the same as saying you can kill a child, an innocent child, because of what their parents did. That is directly taking the punishment that is due to the parents and putting it on the child. We should also note that, again, back to this notion of the biblical view, there are passages in the Bible that suggest that this is not a good thing. For example, in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet states, "The soul who sins is the one who will die. The son will not share the guilt of the father, nor will the father share the guilt of the son." This idea suggests that it is unacceptable to punish parents for the sins of the children, or children for the sins of the parents. In this sense, the collective guilt argument doesn't seem to hold up even biblically. That is, there is internal evidence within the Bible itself that suggests that maybe this wouldn't be okay. But that point aside, there is still the moral question. Is it acceptable for a moral, perfectly good God to command the destruction of children and infants because of the sins of their parents? Again, it seems problematic to maintain this claim. 5th, the human influence response. This response notes that when we're talking about the Bible, we have to note that there are different ways of viewing how the Bible was written. We might think that God dictated every word and that every word represents absolute scientific and historical fact. But most Christians don't maintain this. Most Christians believe that God has inspired authors within their cultural context to speak truth. The truth is influenced by God speaking to these people, but it's also influenced by the human lens through which it is represented. There may be cases then where humans start to mix their own ideas and their own thoughts about cultural realities into the message, and that this message is transmitted into the Bible and through the Bible. Therefore, we can't take everything at face value as if it came directly from God. This response does help us to say, well, maybe God didn't actually command these things, but it raises another hermeneutical problem for us. It sounds then as if we could say that the Bible is authoritative morally and theologically, except where we're uncomfortable with what it says, at which point we can say, well, that's probably just human influence. And then who gets to decide what is human influence and what's divine influence? What interpretive principles do we use to make sense of that? So while this gets God off the hook, so to speak, it also raises other questions about how reliable the Bible is as a moral authority for us. Finally, 6, the broader scope response. In this response, the argument is made that we can't read Cherem outside of the broader context of the Bible as a whole, including the New Testament. While it is true that God makes these claims about destroying children and infants, we have to read this as part of God's broader salvific effort to redeem the entire earth. And this includes the life and ministry of Jesus. So it's kind of like you have these violent episodes in there, but you also have all these notions of mercy and peace and love, and these notions of mercy, peace, and love seem to win out in the end. The problem with this view is it's unclear how it gets God off the hook. I mean, yes, on the one hand, there is plenty about love and mercy and compassion in the Bible. We don't want to ignore that. But on the other hand, that doesn't make the slaughter and genocide okay. I mean, if you had a good friend and your good friend was like, I talk about love and mercy all the time, and typically I'm a loving and merciful person, but every now and then I just go out and kill a bunch of kids, well, we're not going to be like, oh yeah, well, on the whole, you're a good person. no, we're going to be bothered by this and say, this is unacceptable. All of these responses are helpful in some way, and some combination of them is probably necessary to even begin to come to terms with some of the violence that is prescribed in the Bible. But on the whole, I think it's helpful to just stand back and say, wow, these passages are terrible. The Bible has places where it supports, even celebrates the enslavement of conquered people. The Bible has places where it demands the destruction of children and infants. We should be horrified by this. We should struggle with it. It should not be easy for us to come to terms with these passages, to make peace with them. It should not be easy for us to say, well, God is God and we are not, so it's all good. With passages like this, I think it's best to say, God, if you did command this, we are mortified, horrified by this. This is awful. How could you do that? And again, if you go back to our last video on Moses challenging God over the fate of Israel, and as we'll note later, the prophets do the same thing, perhaps that's a better response than pure and unchallenging acquiescence to God's violence. At any rate, it's important to note that almost all Christians and Jews today suggest that the practice of cherem is no longer viable. So at least that's good. So to the question, what do you think about these passages in the Bible? How do you come to terms with them, if at all? Until next time, see you later.